welcome along to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Ian McKnight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And today on the show, we're talking about I've paid off my home loan. What's next? This comes from a listener of the show who says, hey, I've just paid off my home loan on my owner-occupier property. What should I do now with the money going towards that property or that was going towards that mortgage? Now, just for context, he's currently got 2 investment properties, both on interest only. Now, Andrew, what happens when somebody pays off their mortgage?
You celebrate. It wasn't that good a joke, Ed. Nice one. So you got more cash flow, first of all. So let's say you had a $500K mortgage when you took it out and you're paying it off over 20 years at 4%. Well, that's $700 a week that you now get to spend instead of paying on a mortgage. Second thing is it improves your servicing. So if you're not spending $700 a week on a personal mortgage, well, you can borrow more money from the bank if you want to invest in property. So we'll talk about what that looks like later on.
Now, let's talk through the options. If you guys watch it on the YouTube, I've built a little flow diagram. Otherwise, for everybody listening to the podcast version, I'll just explain it. Really, the first 2 things is you can either continue investing, take that $700 and invest in something, or you could actually take that $700 and just spend it on cars. What else do people spend money on other than investments? I don't know.
Boats,
restaurants, wine, something like that. Now, we're not going to focus too much on that. We're going to focus on investing today, but I just want to acknowledge that that is a legitimate option. Now, after that, you've really got 2 options. You could either put that money back into property or you could take that money and put it into something else. Now, let's say that you are going to go down the property version. Again, you've got 2 options if you want to put that money into property. You can either use it to expand your portfolio, and we'll walk through the numbers of what this all looks like in a second, or you could actually pay down the debt on your current properties. And I've built some modelling to show what that looks like in terms of the returns. But of course, you don't have to put it in property. You could invest in something else. So that could be savings, shares, bonds and term deposits, or crypto, whatever other asset class. And
the C word.
Well, we'll go through the modelling in a second of what this all looks like. But let's go through the options with property. So walk us through, Andrew, what are the options with property?
Okay, so expand your portfolio. That's one. You can go and take that $700 a week that you did have and apply for more lending. Now, based on $700 a week that you were making on mortgage payments, if you take that based on what allows for an extra UMI that you've got, so how much more uncommitted monthly income does that allow me to borrow from the bank? That gives you another purchase of about $750,000. So you've got more purchasing power of $750K, so you can go out and buy an investment property. Now, that doesn't mean you're having to contribute that full $700 towards repayments of your investment property. That's just how much extra you could borrow from a bank's perspective. The other option is that you pay down debt against other investments. So if you've got those 2 existing rental properties, you could just pay those down. So let's talk about when you would expand your portfolio and when you'd pay down debt. So when you'd expand your portfolio, well, if you've still got a wealth gap. So if those 2 properties and everything else that you're doing doesn't get you to where you want to be, you need to be investing in property more or other investments. But, if you took that $700 and that doesn't get you there, then property is probably the option. If you're relatively young and you've got a long time horizon between now and retirement, well, you probably want to be investing in property then. If you've got low debt on your other 2 investments, because you've got them ages ago and they're just ticking along nicely, paying for themselves, then again, you probably want to use that usable equity in those to buy again. And so now let's talk about when you might pay down debt. Well, if you're closer to retirement, so you're 60 plus and maybe it's not the right time for you to buy an investment property, well, then you'd probably pay down debt on your investments. Or if you're highly leveraged and later on in life. So if those mortgages on the rental properties are really high, maybe you're going to be smashed with the interest deductibility rules because they're old properties. Maybe that's when you'd look to pay down debt. And just one note there, you don't necessarily have to pay down debt. You could actually use an offset facility or revolving credit.
And that would allow you to save on mortgage interest costs while still having access to the funds there. But typically you do see this dichotomy where if you're earlier on in life, typically you'll just increase the number of assets because you're not too worried about taking on more debt. If you're a little later on in life, that's when people tend to get more worried about debt because they're going to stop working, their income's going to go down, they're not going to be able to service it as well. And that's why you'd see somebody making that decision.
A big part of it is how long have you got on the horizon, like, to weather the storm. If we have a few flat years in property, well, that's not that great investing in property now. But if you have 20 years horizon, then it's a no-brainer, right?
I always get very giddy just thinking about, this is terrible, but I always say to people, I've got 35 years before I hit 65. And in my mind, there's literally no worries in my mind about the value of the properties. There's no question in my mind, I should say, that the value of the property is going to be significantly higher by the time I hit retirement. Oh. So I should just buy as many as I can today. That's my point of view. Won't be everybody's. Now, let's talk about what gives you the higher return, paying down debt or buying more property. Now, as we usually do, we model it all out in a spreadsheet, and we've actually looked at it. So here are the returns that I'll put on the screen for everybody who's watching on the YouTube, but otherwise I'll just explain them. If you go down and decide, I'm going to put that money per week into paying down debt, and here I'm talking about just switching one property to interest only. I'm not talking about the full $700. And I think it's a marginal $100 or so per week. Now, if you did that, paid down debt and switched one of those properties to a 30-year P&I term, and I've made some assumptions about what it is because the person who asked this question, I don't actually have any of their details. Well, the marginal return from paying down debt is about 144 odd K. Now, for that, you had to put in cash flow of about $102,000. Now, that's over a 15-year period. Now, the ROI of spending that 102K making those principal repayments is 41% odd. So you put it 102K, you got back 144K, your return is 42%. Now, if you were to buy more property, and it's a similar level of cash flow, it's about 87K you'd have to put in order to purchase that additional investment property, and I've made some assumptions here. The marginal return from that is just over $500,000, inflation adjusted. And the reason behind that is you've increased your level of assets, and so you've got capital growth on those. So the marginal ROI on that is just shy of 235%. So you're looking at a 5 times better return for buying more property as opposed to paying down debt. And here we're talking about, say, $100 a week difference as opposed to $700 a week, which is what they're actually getting out of this. Yeah. Now, look, here's the crux of it. We're up to episode 1040 something, but typically buying more property gives the higher return most of the time, assuming a couple of things. Assuming that there is some amount of decent capital growth into the future. Here we always model off 5%. Assuming that you're investing for the long term and assuming that you're highly leveraged because it is the high amount of leverage that allows you to get out the high returns on the other end because you're putting in only a little bit of cash but getting out the large returns. But what I really want to know, Andrew, is we've got to go down the other side as well and talk about, well, what else could somebody invest in if they were to take this approach? And again, we've done some modelling of that paying down debt scenario versus the purchasing an additional property. And I'll pull up that graph now for you.
Cool. So, the other options are, savings, shares, something else. We're not going to go into the something else like crypto and things like that because there's no fair and reasonable track record for that we could actually use for modelling. So
you're not a crypto bro.
No. Is that even a term?
Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, we've modelled out the extra benefit that you get from paying down debt compared to the other investment types. So what the graph shows is that paying down debt is actually second highest to shares. So shares is actually a higher return if you look at putting that money aside diligently over a period of time.
And this is just looking at the marginal benefit of paying down the mortgages that you've already got. Because any capital growth on the investment properties you've already got, well, you're going to get anyway because you already own them. This is about if you decide that you're going to pay down debt more aggressively, and we're just looking at the marginal return.
Now, it's not a huge difference, but there is a difference here, right?
Yeah, well, if you were to go out and pay down debt, you'd come out with, in this scenario, about 120 odd K out the end of it, whereas if you were to invest in shares, it's just shy of 160K. Now, obviously, if you're going to go into a managed fund or a term deposit, hey, the returns are a bit lower. But this is typically what you'd see where the higher risk things like investing in shares gets the higher reward, paying down debt investing in property in that instance comes second, because we're not looking at a leverage effect here. So you might wonder, well, should I just invest in shares then? Well, it depends on your risk appetite. At the moment, shares are pretty down. Some people might be quite nervous about that. Share prices are relatively volatile, and of course the dividends change year to year.
Absolutely. Whereas, if you're paying down debt, it's a pretty guaranteed return because your interest rate is fixed by the bank.
And therefore, every dollar you pay off your mortgage, the less interest that attracts. So it does have a more certain return, I always say, when you're paying down debt. But Andrew, also walk us through, what if you were to buy an additional investment property? What do the returns look like?
Now, again, this is assuming that you can go into the bank and you can get some money to be able to do that. Well, at that stage, buying a new property will significantly outperform the other types of investments, including shares, because of the fact that, like you said before, you're using other people's money to do it. Now, in that kind of scenario as well, what I like about this is you might be topping up that property, even say, let's say it was $200 a week. Say it was quite a large amount because of higher interest rates right now or the next few years. Well, you might pay $200 a week for the next few years, and then it might drop down to $50 a week. And then in 7 years, it might be cash flow positive or neutral. So you get some of that money back. Meanwhile, you've still got another $500 a week that you can use to invest in shares or pay down debt. So you're not exhausting all that money, and you've got a higher return on investment.
And I think that's probably what this person would end up doing, is they would split that money out into a couple of different things. So. You might use some of it to pay down some debt. You might use some of it in order to purchase the next investment property, and you might use some of it to keep in shares. Now, of course, if you're going to start paying down debt, you might do our standard strategy, which is using an offset or revolving credit facility in order to make sure that that money's still liquid. Now, in your situation, what should you do? Well, that's the fun of investing. It depends. And of course, what's really important to note is that while the highest modelled return, and I always am very clear on that, it's a modelled return based on some assumptions, is purchasing the additional investment property, what you might actually do is split it over a couple of different things. And I do want to say that, we've used some example numbers here. I think a $500K mortgage and a couple of properties that are worth 600 something thousand, just because we didn't have this list as personal numbers. And of course, that's why this isn't personalised financial advice. This is some modelling and two guys sitting around with a microphone. You're going to have to either get some personalised financial advice or, make a decision about what's going to be right for you. Now, hey, look, we're going to wrap it up there, but please don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the Property Academy podcast, because it really does help us get the message out to more people. And Tate, we've got a webinar coming up, and we are talking about the right way to invest in property in 2022. And that webinar is on Tuesday, the 2nd of August at 7 p.m. Really hoping to see you there. There's going to be about 3,000 of you, and we're going to have a great time. How do you sign up for that? Links down in the show notes or on the YouTube description, or just go to opuspartners.co.nz/webinar. You'll be able to sign up there. Thanks for listening to the Property Academy podcast. I'm your host, Emmett Knight.
I'm Andrew Nicol.
And we're going to be back again tomorrow with even more daily strategies, tactics, and insights to help you get the most out of the New Zealand property market. Until next time.